believe we're live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics Summer Spotlight webinar series. My name is Lorien Abroms, and I'm a professor at the Milken Institute School of Public Health. And today we're so excited to have David Broniatowski presenting. He's going to be presenting on Can Communicating Gist Inform Responses to Foreign and Domestic Online Manipulation of the Vaccine Debate. A little bit about David. David's an associate professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences here at GW. He conducts research in decision-making under risk, group decision-making, system architecture, and behavioral epidemiology. He received his PhD from MIT in engineering. And today he's going to be telling us about his 5 years of research on how vaccines are discussed online, the implications of online vaccine communication for political discourse, and the relationship between the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak and prior opposition to vaccination. So with that, we're about to get started. Just one housekeeping note is that please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And also to let you know that David's going to be pausing during the presentation. So please put your questions in throughout the presentation, and David can get to some of them during the presentation and then go over the big ones at the end. With that, I turn it over to David.
Great, thank you very much. Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. Pull up my slides here again. Having technical difficulties here. There we go. All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. My name is David Broniatowski. I have a title here that's called Can Communicating Gist Inform Responses? And so one of the things that I want to start off with here is just a definition of what do I mean by gist? What is gist? So by gist, we mean bottom line, meaning, and context. And gist is something that we compare to verbatim. I'm starting out with this introduction here because I think it's really important to contextualize the debate that we're facing now. You've all heard about anti-vaxxers. You've all heard about anti-mask protesters around COVID-19. People are taking actions that are endangering the public health, and they are doing so in many cases for reasons that, that may be difficult to understand for people who don't necessarily engage with those narratives. So what we're going to talk about today is the results of a 5-year-long NIH study that I led that essentially looks at how people talk about vaccines online, more recently the implications of this for the COVID pandemic, and some possible ways that we may try to address some of this misinformation. So to start out with, what you see over here on the left is what we call verbatim facts. If you go into your doctor's office, you're probably going to see some pamphlets like this, lots of information, flu vaccine reduces your risk of flu, 40 minus 60%, a picture of a virus, lots and lots of detail. And you show this to the average person and they may not know what it means. Now compare that to the gist. The CDC flu fact. The flu vaccine does not cause flu. A flu vaccine is the best protection against the flu. Very simple bottom line meaning and context. Now, of course, it's not only the CDC that communicates at different levels of representation. What you see here is an example of two, what we call anti-vaccine messages. One over here is actually from a group called Stop Mandatory Vaccination, which is quite popular. And it really gets to the bottom line of what this particular group claims to stand for. I'm educated, I'm not afraid, and I decide. Simple bottom line meaning. Compare that to a much more sort of verbatim oriented, still kind of vaccine opposing message. The CD protocol brings about healing by killing pathogens, resolving systemic inflammation, and revitalizing damaged immune system functioning. It addresses candida, bacteria, parasites, viruses, and heavy metals. And you are left wondering, unless you have some kind of background in this area, you are left wondering, so what? What does it mean? So I'm starting that out as a sort of a framing device here. What I want to talk about is the way in which people derive meaning can shape their health behaviors and how that can give us some direct insight into how we might combat misinformation online. So now fast forward to this year, 2020, we are facing a COVID-19 infodemic. The words of the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, he called an infodemic an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And so what you're seeing here is a table that compares the scale of messages just on Twitter about COVID-19 compared to other sources. The total number of tweets using just 3 hashtags was 186 million over a period of about 2 months. In that same time period, the total number of messages about vaccines was roughly a third. So just 3 hashtags gave us 3 times as many tweets as, I want to say, something on the order of like 65 vaccine-related keywords. So to make it quite clear here, we are drowning in information about COVID-19. We have lots and lots and lots of information, but do we have insight? Do we know what it means and what to do? So I'm going to start out by talking about the scope of the problem. The fact that we are constantly drowning. We have too much information about vaccines, and then even more so about COVID-19. And this actually creates an environment in which different actors with different agendas try to interpret that information for us. They say, pay attention to this, not to that. This means this, not that. And these actors can be state-sponsored, they can be domestic. And not only is the information volume high, but that information in many cases is what I call laundered. It comes through sources that cannot be assessed for their credibility. Right now, we're spending quite a bit of effort in the research community trying to determine, is this a credible source? Is this not a credible source? Is this true? Is this false? And what our preliminary research in this area shows is that actually we can't say. And so that further increases the uncertainty, and this motivates the GIST approach as a protective factor. And so I'm going to cover that today. So we've already known as early as at least 2012 that just the facts, giving people just the facts, doesn't seem to drive their decisions, their health decisions, but probably also decisions in other domains. A whole special issue of the top journal pertaining to vaccination called Vaccine concluded that narratives were the key driving factor. They are memorable, they're easy to understand, and they are compelling. And they gave an example of anti-vaccine tropes as tropes that use these narratives in order to make their points and to be compelling. So according to fuzzy trace theory, the theory that I'm going to talk about today, what is it that makes these narrative compelling? According to fuzzy trace theory, it's the gist. It's the coherent story about causality. The thing that gives you meaning and insight. It connects the dots. It satisfies a meaning threat when people are uncertain and facing an uncertain environment. That's what makes people take actions, not just the facts, but putting those facts together into something that they can make sense from. And so messages that produce these meaningful gists are going to be more influential. So an example here are conspiracy theories. We've all seen conspiracy theories. One of the most common ones is that vaccines cause autism. That's been around since 1998. But we might ask, why is this so hard to get rid of? And the reason why is because it presents a story, a causal story. The child got vaccinated and then the child got symptoms of autism. Therefore, it must be that vaccines cause autism. Whereas in fact, that's a spurious correlation. It means that it would have happened anyway. But it makes a good story because it's something that explains an otherwise mysterious event. The fact of the matter is we don't know what causes autism, but we do know that it's not vaccines. So organized campaigns have for a long time been using social media to take the facts as they see them and to put them into their preferred narratives. We were tracking this 4 or 5 years ago, when the Zika epidemic started, where we started looking at reports from a group that called themselves the Physicians in the Crop Sprayed Villages regarding dengue Zika, and they claimed that it actually wasn't a new virus, the Zika virus, that was causing birth defects in South America. Rather, it was the use of a pesticide. And that pesticide was manufactured by Monsanto, the company that makes genetically modified organisms, they claimed. And because of the use of that pesticide, that's what was causing the birth defects. And so there are several problems with this story. One of them is that Monsanto doesn't actually make that pesticide. The second one is that we know the risk profile of that pesticide, and birth defects of that sort are not one of them. But most importantly, there is again this notion of a spurious correlation. Wherever you have mosquitoes, you're going to have pesticides, you're going to have larvicides. So of course you're going to see mosquito-borne illnesses in the places where you have mosquitoes, which is also where you're going to have pesticides. And so again, what you have here are people putting the facts together into a narrative that makes sense. And because it makes sense to the listener, even though it's not true, it's more likely to be accepted and cause people to take action. And in fact, that's what we saw around Zika. Brazilians were very skeptical that the Zika virus even existed and that it was actually causing this particular birth defect. And that got in the way of an effective public health response. Fast forward now to COVID-19, and we see the same playbook. We see all sorts of reasons why people are saying, for example, that 5G wireless is causing the coronavirus. It's not really a virus, it's this other thing. Because wherever you have large groupings of people, you have more cell phone towers. Wherever you have more cell phone towers, you have more incidents of the virus. So again, this notion of a spurious correlation. And so we saw this around other types of vaccines as well, people blaming the vaccine for the disease. And in fact, if you look at how these pseudoscientific claims were spread, then you see that the people who were spreading them were indeed taking an existing narrative and fitting the facts into them. 85% of the users who tweeted about Zika being a hoax previously had tweeted something else about some other vaccine, and 57% of those had previously tweeted about some other anti-vaccine hoax. So people are taking these facts and they're fitting them into their existing stories. And so the question then becomes, is this grassroots? Are these people simply misinformed? Or is it AstroTurf? Is there some sort of organization behind that? And in fact, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to address some questions. I see one over here that's listed, where somebody asks, maybe I'm ahead of you, but is that a seemingly Russian-aligned website in the background? This would certainly track. Thank you very much for that question. We are going to discuss exactly that as we move forward. But yes, there's all sorts of foreign actors engaged in this particular debate. So I'm happy to pause briefly for questions, but if not, I'll move on and try to address this. Grassroots or AstroTurf, what have we found? Okay. So moving on, we started out by looking at a range of different actors online. And one of the things that we found rather recently came out of the Facebook ad archive. We simply downloaded several ads related to vaccines, and we categorized them as pro or anti-vaccine based on their content. And what we found was that among the anti-vaccine ads, the vast majority, well, the majority, were shared by only 2 buyers. Those would be World Mercury Project and Stop Mandatory Vaccination. And the top 5 were quite a large majority. Those were almost 75% of all anti-vaccine ads were only 5 buyers. So that suggests that there's a lot of concentration. There's a small number of people that are putting out these anti-vaccine ads. Compare that to the pro-vaccine ads, where you do see there's a little bit of concentration, but nowhere near the same scale. The biggest buyer here is Gates Foundation, followed by Walmart. Walmart simply advertising that they have flu vaccines in stock. And then, you know, these small, long tail ads over here by local public health agencies. So in fact, we do see that there's a lot of concentration. And so then that leads us to the question of what is it that these groups are saying online? And what you're seeing now is a result that's in press right now at the American Journal of Public Health. It will be in print very soon. And over here, we looked at Facebook pages. We identified 204 different pages pertaining to the vaccine debate that were opposing vaccination. And we categorized these pages into different types. There were pages that primarily focused on things like alternative medicine. So for example, people might say things like, don't get vaccinated, take vitamin C, right? Or conspiracy theories, people who might say something like vaccines are the government trying to microchip you. Safety and efficacy. This is an example of people saying the vaccines cause the disease they were intended to prevent. So for example, a lot of people will say that the polio vaccine causes polio. Civil liberties are people saying things like, I don't want the government to tell me that I should be vaccinated, and so we should oppose vaccine mandates. And then finally, morality are people saying things like vaccines are not God's will. And so if we look at these time series over here, what we see is that civil liberties in particular has grown significantly. And there are 3 vertical lines. This one corresponds to an outbreak of measles at Disneyland, the Disneyland measles outbreak in 2015. And what we see is that that increased overall, just the overall amount of vaccine content, everything went up because it put the anti-vaxxer agenda on in the public debate. People started talking about it. In fact, what was going on at the time was that California started to pass a bill that would have that did remove several vaccine philosophical exemptions. And so people started saying, wait a minute, I feel like my civil liberties are being infringed. Roughly a year later, we saw the launch of a movie called Vaxxed. This movie was directed by the same physician who has since lost his license for fraudulently claiming that vaccines cause autism. He released a movie, and once that movie came up, now we start to see that civil liberties was discussed. So after the release of Vaxxed, we start to see a lot of posts discussing vaccination as a civil liberty. It's my right to choose. And then finally, what we see here in 2019, just a year ago, was that the number of posts in these groups went off the charts because there was a measles outbreak, and all of the people who had mobilized around civil liberties were now taking that mobilization, and we were ready to oppose vaccines in the public discourse, and in many cases were very well informed as to what they should or should not vote for. So what we're seeing here is that more and more the discussion is about values and less about science. We see a decrease. This green line over here is safety and efficacy. And if you look at the scale, what you see is actually going from 20% to 10%. So it's quite a big drop. So we're seeing a decrease in discussion about safety and efficacy. People are talking about the vaccine science less and less. And we see that being replaced by an increase in orange over here in political and civil liberties discussion, which basically boils down to people saying, well, you know, it's my choice. It's my decision. I don't want the government telling me what to do. And the thing about this particular framing is that we no longer have to think about the science. When people frame vaccination as a civil liberty, then what that means in practice is that they get to make the choice. And when they say, well, it's my choice, then it's no longer about what does the science say. It becomes an issue of values. And in fact, what we see is that there is an increase in the people who worked on Vaxxed. So we see, for example, the movie promotion going up here in gray, coincident with the movie. But as that was going up, the producer of the movie was also mentioned much more on social media. And so what we're basically seeing is that the release of this movie started to coincide with the framing of the debate as a civil right. And that takes us to where we are today in COVID-19, where more and more opponents of the COVID-19 vaccine seem to be mobilizing. They seem to be framing vaccine refusal as it's my right to choose. And of course, what that does in practice is it exposes us all to the risk of getting sick if and when that vaccine becomes available. But it started to have spillover effects, because now we're not only seeing vaccine refusal, we're starting to see people using public health in general as a civil rights issue. People are now starting to politicize wearing masks. People are starting to politicize public health advice from certain well-known officials. And that was something that actually we've been tracking for roughly 5 years and is an extension of what the vaccine debate initiated. And we expect that to grow. So one of the things that we're more and more tracking is that vaccination, which was previously not a partisan issue, as recently as 2013, we have very solid data showing that vaccine was not a partisan issue, but it is increasingly become one. And here we have to be very careful. We have to be careful not to assume that one party knows the truth and the other party does not, even though it's becoming partisan, and one party may frame the debate as civil rights. And in fact, what we see is that among the top 2,000 anti-vaccine accounts, those accounts that tended to discuss conservative politics were more likely to oppose vaccines, and those discussing liberal politics were more likely to support vaccines. I really want to emphasize here that it's not just conspiracy theories. On the contrary, vaccine opponents and proponents are fitting the infodemic into their narratives. And what we saw over here, which is a little bit distressing, is that in the lead up to the COVID-19 pandemic in February and March of this year, both pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine accounts were linked to misleading claims about the coronavirus. Now, the sorts of claims were very different, with the anti-vaccine accounts using the same narratives that they previously did. Narratives like this is a conspiracy, certain international actors are trying to microchip you, this is something that infringes on your civil liberties and civil rights, all the tropes that we saw over the past 5 years, maybe even 10 years, we see now around COVID-19. But even pro-vaccine accounts initially were getting it wrong. We had a lot of accounts that were saying things like, well, are you worried about COVID-19? Don't be worried about COVID-19, go get a flu shot. If you're really worried, the flu kills a lot more people than COVID-19, so you should be getting a flu shot. And one might argue that that's actually an appropriate thing to do, because after all, people should get flu shots. It would reduce the incidence of flu. However, what we see is that now the vaccine opponents, anti-vaxxers, have taken up exactly this theme and are now using it against coronavirus vaccination. They're basically saying, well, COVID is basically the flu. We don't need to get a flu shot. Well, you know, it's just the sniffles, right? And so instead, don't worry about COVID-19. COVID-19 is not that big a deal. So what we're starting to see is that misinformation is not just conspiracy theories. It's not just false facts. It's not just people who are wrong on the internet, essentially. It is the putting facts as people perceive them into a narrative that has a meaning that's not consistent with the science, and may be just as dangerous to a society preparing for a pandemic. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is how different international actors are using this uncertain information environment to advance their own agendas. The Global Engagement Center in the US State Department recently established 3 teams. One was focused on Russian disinformation, the other on Chinese, and the other on Iranian disinformation. And testimony of Leah Gabriel, the special envoy and coordinator of the GEC, gave testimony to Congress, basically stating that the full Russian ecosystem of state media, news sites, and social personas have been pushing multiple disinformation narratives, and that this is a known Russian tactic. And in fact, this is something that we saw in our own vaccine data as early as 2014, where we noticed that there was a prevalence of bot accounts, and in particular Russian trolls from the Internet Research Agency, the same group that was whose officials were indicted by the Mueller report for interfering in the US elections, were also very active in promoting vaccination related messages. Now the thing here is, one might think, well, maybe they're promoting anti-vaccine messages, but that's actually not the case. Russian trolls, which were this group over here, were significantly more likely to talk about vaccines than anybody else. However, if you look at the proportion of messages that were anti-vaccine, it was about 50-50. So that's weird. It tells us that the Russians were not involved, strictly speaking, in trying to undermine vaccine confidence. So what we did here is we did a little bit of a deeper dive into the contents of what they were talking about. And we started to identify some messages that were anti-vaccine and some that were pro-vaccine. And the anti-vaccine messages, again, had the standard anti-vaccine tropes. Did you know that vaccines cause autism? Don't get vaccines, Illuminati are behind it, serious and fatal side effects, etc. But now let's take a look at what they said that was pro-vaccine. Vaccines are a parent's choice. Choice of the color of a little coffin. Or, do you still treat your kids with leaves? No, and why don't you vaccinate them? It's medicine. These are pro-vaccine tweets, yes, but they are tweets that are fundamentally about making people angry. They are about promoting discord. And in fact, if you do a deeper dive into this data set, which an excellent paper by Walter et al. Did this past January in the American Journal of Public Health, what they found was that the Russian trolls were actually active in creating personas. One persona was a pro-Trump persona. Another persona was a Black Lives Matter persona. And these different personas were using the vaccine debate in order to inflame existing racial and political tensions in the United States. And so what we see here is that, again, there are a set of narratives that are out there. There are different ways of looking at the world and constructing meaning from the facts as they exist. And our adversaries are actively using those narratives in order to promote anger and inflame racial tension. So what is it that we've seen as far as COVID-19? Well, joint with Eileen Kaliskan, a colleague of mine here at GW in the computer science department, one of the things we started to do was look at some of the anti-Chinese rhetoric that came out on Twitter around the time that there was a lot of increased attention to COVID-19 as it started to spread in the US. And what we found was that, as expected, China was associated with unpleasantness and panic. People were obviously, in these anti-Chinese hashtags, obviously they were concerned about China. But what we saw was that Russia was associated with calm and with pleasantness. So essentially, we have what may be a campaign that frames Russia as the calm, successful actor in the face of this COVID-19 outbreak. And we're continuing to do research in this area in order to determine if this is in fact a disinformation campaign or if they are what some politicians euphemistically call patriots. But if so, it would be quite aligned with recent events just of the past few days. As some of you may be aware, that Russia recently claimed that they have now released a vaccine that would be able to treat the coronavirus. But a report on this in Science makes very clear that the safety of this Russian vaccine has not been assessed, that the Russian government has been involved in actually trying to target Western COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers. Unclear the reason why, although one might speculate. Around the same time that these espionage attacks were going on, we start seeing groups from the different BRICS countries. Again, this would be Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa getting together. And we see, for example, over here, somebody saying BRICS countries should be the first to get the corona vaccine. So why is this problematic? Well, because at the same time, what we see is an existing narrative that claims that the Western world is going to test out any coronavirus vaccine on Africans and to use them as guinea pigs, which promotes vaccine hesitancy. And so what we see over here is an attempt, seemingly an attempt on the part of Russia to basically position themselves as a leader in the vaccination field, as opposed to what we see in the US. But of course, with the caveat here that by cutting corners and creating a vaccine that may not actually be safe, it may blow up in everyone's face and reduce people's likelihood of getting any vaccine, because people may think that vaccines in general are not safe and effective. So I'm going to pause here and take a look at one of the questions. Curious about your thoughts on how the limit of content actually available to researchers might affect your conclusions around civil liberty discourse. Facebook pages and groups and Twitter hashtags are probably just the tip of the icebergs, and by the time these groups are joined or hashtags used, people are already radicalized. Yes, so that's an excellent question. And like any analysis, we are of course limited to the data that we have available. And I really want to emphasize here that this analysis was an analysis of Facebook pages. Facebook pages are fundamentally online content that represents celebrities and brands and businesses. These are the, if you will, the anti-vaccine elite talking. And so they are framing this as civil liberties discourse. Can we conclude from that that the vast majority of members of these pages agree with that discourse? No, of course we can't, because we haven't asked them. We haven't done any study, and there would be no ethical way to do such a study on that scale. However, what we can do is we can observe that there has been a very clear uptick in the way in which people across platforms, across media, are now framing vaccines. And we can compare the fact that people are now talking about this as opposed to scientific framing over time. We can basically see an increase in the way that the elites in the anti-vaccine community are talking about it. Presumably, the scientific approach was becoming less effective, and the political approach may be more so, and certainly that's the concern. So I hope that answers the question. So, of course, the Global Engagement Center didn't only mention Russia, they also mentioned China. And so one of the things they mentioned here was that they've monitored a couple of different narrative tracks, one of which is a narrative that falsely blames the US as the origin of the coronavirus. But the other one, and I really want to focus on this, tries to turn the crisis into a story that highlights the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Why might they want to do that beyond sort of your typical, promotion of a system, a system of government? So what I want to mention over here is the context in which this occurred. In July 2018, the Chinese government actually had a major scandal in which a rabies vaccine that was manufactured by a Chinese company was found to have been ineffective. And this particular vaccine, the story about this particular vaccine was posted on a blog, and that story went viral on Weibo, which is, people call it the Chinese Twitter, but it is in fact larger than Twitter. In short, what we found was that public trust in the public health system among the Chinese citizens had already been eroding when the COVID-19 outbreak occurred. And so the Chinese government perhaps finds itself in a situation where it really needs to take actions, even ranging on propaganda actions, to bolster its own citizens' confidence in its actions. And if you look at the data over here, I apologize, these graphs are a little bit messy. What we see is that during and before the scandal, people talked a lot about vaccines in very positive ways in China. They would say something along the lines of, well, my child just got vaccinated. I'm so proud of them, they didn't even cry. And then as the scandal broke out, these number of self-reports went way down. But 1 year later, we see that the number of reports of self-vaccination actually went up, but now they're negative. They were, my child just got vaccinated, they have this rash. Are they gonna be okay? I'm really worried. Keeping in mind that Weibo as a platform is subject to censorship by the Chinese government, you're not going to see a lot of anti-vaccine messages, but the absence of pro-vaccine messages is in fact instructive. And what we see over here is that messages reflecting doubt in government were very, very high immediately after the scandal and then have since gone away. But again, these negative self-reports are increasingly prevalent. And then finally, the Global Engagement Center mentioned Iran as an outlet that publishes false stories alleging that the US has weaponized the coronavirus. And here, I think we can really focus on a very similar story, perhaps, to what may be going on in China, where the government itself is engaged in trying to control the outbreak, but for whatever reason is not, doesn't seem to have an effective response. The number of coronavirus cases continues to grow in Iran, and this is joint work with one of my students. There seems to be a disproportionately high number of satire-related posts on Twitter in Iran, which seems to increasingly reflect perhaps a fatalistic attitude on the part of Twitter users in Iran. Some other things were, interesting insights. The conspiracy theories here are being used, but they're being used to promote social distancing. So for example, people might say the US created COVID-19 as a bioweapon, so you better stay home so you don't get sick. Something that sort of seems to be unique about the Iranian discourse, and this is work that's in progress. So looking across the overall landscape of non-credible information sources, what we find is that, in fact, around COVID-19, some of the major state-sponsored sources are significantly more likely to tweet about COVID-19 than they are about either other health issues or vaccines. And we see that from RT.com and Sputnik News, both Russian sources, PressTV.com, which is an Iranian source, and then CGTN and Xinhua, both of which are Chinese sources. So we see elevated rates. So clearly, all of these governments, as the State Department said, are discussing COVID-19 at elevated rates, presumably for propaganda purposes. But again, it's really important to contextualize this. What we see over here is all of the URLs from these coronavirus data sets that come from these different unrated sources. And the Russian and Iranian sources are a small slice of this small red slice over here, right? So the number of tweets from clearly not credible sources that can be rated as not credible, is actually lower, 1.4%, it's tiny, is actually lower for COVID-19 than it is for either health-related tweets in general or vaccine-related tweets. Overall, there's much more information being shared online from credible sources. Credible sources including government sources, academic sources, and news sources that engage in rigorous standards of fact-checking. But interestingly, the vast majority of content here, this black part of the pie graph, reflects unrated sources. These are people talking about the coronavirus and talking about it using sources that we do not know what their factual accuracy is. In many cases, perhaps because they come by being referenced from social media. So for example, somebody may be pointing to a YouTube link. YouTube, you can't rate YouTube as a whole for its credibility because it's user-generated content. Periscope TV, which is another video platform, and Instagram, an image platform. All of these three, these are the three largest sources over here, and they make up a big chunk of overall social media. Technology and computing, health and fitness, people trying to sell stuff. All of these are sources of content online. And just by looking at the URLs in an automated way, we can't tell, which means the average consumer, the average user of social media can't tell whether or not they should believe these sources. So we are faced with genuine scientific uncertainty, and it takes us all the way back to the claim that I made at the start of the talk. Everyone's falling back on their preferred narrative because there is simply no credible source that people can turn to that has the volume in order to help people to make sense of this narrative. And so before getting into the next question of how should we respond, well, there's an anonymous attendee who asked, do you have recommendations for how scientists can positively influence the vaccine discussion? Yes, that's what the next section is about. Thank you very much for that question. We will address that shortly. There is one more question that says, I'm just wondering, from your experience about any Trump effect in the AV communities, I found a major shift in how these communities talk about politics starting from 2016. Yeah, we actually do have a paper about that. I didn't have a chance to cover that in this presentation, but I'm happy to send out a pointer to it. Long story short is that while Trump was still a candidate, one of the things that he said on the campaign trail was that vaccines cause autism, which had the immediate effect of mobilizing several of these vaccine-related communities and declaring him to be essentially their candidate, whereas Hillary Clinton was using a hashtag called Grandmothers Know Best, which was trying to essentially promote vaccination. And there's a lot that could be said about that. It's unclear if it's necessarily a Trump effect per se, or whether it is that the anti-vaxxers basically started to band around Trump. Certainly now he's talking about using Operation Warp Speed and promoting vaccines around COVID-19. At the same time, what we've started to see in a lot of the, for example, the QAnon communities, some of these conspiracy communities, is that there's actually a robust internal debate in these communities as to whether or not the president is in fact in favor of vaccines. And you know, that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down right now as to what the conspiracy theorists think about what the president believes. Suffice it to say that there are a lot lot of ideas out there, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation about that offline. Okay, so I'm going to keep on moving over here. One of the key things that I mentioned is the role of narratives and the role of stories. And one of the key things is that stories often communicate a gist, this bottom line meaning, but not always. And in fact, this is part of a debate that's been going on in the medical world for well over 10 years. Doctors and several prominent health officials are trained. Give the people the facts, don't tell them what to do. Telling them what to do perhaps is paternalistic. We believe in shared decision-making, giving people the right to choose. And so there's a hesitancy to give people stories because that's not necessarily the facts. People might appear biased. But according to fuzzy trace theory, people actually encode information in multiple levels of representation. And so what that means is that you can give people the facts, but you can also tell them, here's what the facts mean. And that's going to be more effective. So a verbatim representation, just the facts, maybe measles can lead to pneumonia, deafness, lifelong brain damage, and even death, and almost a third of children with measles have to be hospitalized, right? Which is a fact. Now the gist, the bottom line meaning here is taking any risk that your child could get the measles isn't worth it. Vaccination is the best way to protect your child. It takes that fact and it tells people, here's what that means for you. So stories should be effective if they communicate this gist, if they cue these relevant moral and social principles and help people to make meaning out of this overwhelming set of facts that they have available. And so we studied this in the context of the Disneyland measles outbreak. The outbreak itself began in December 2014 at Disneyland, and as I mentioned before, really put anti-vaxxers on the map because it led people to propose legislative mandates. And whenever you have a mandate, whenever you're telling people what to do, you can expect a response. People say, don't tell me what to do, right? Rather than explaining the meaning, people started to essentially apply legislative power. And so what we did over here is we coded 4,500 out of almost 40,000 outbreak-related articles. And we measured how frequently they were shared on Facebook. And we used workers online to tell us, did they contain statistics? Did they contain this gist or bottom line meaning? Did they have a story? And some other covariates. And just again, give you an example, something containing a gist was an article like opting out of vaccination is a recipe for an outbreak, or on the anti-vaccine side, militant Australian vaccine and fluoride fanatics seek to eliminate free speech. Something that may not have a gist is something like Clinton's medical advisor and anti-vaccination activist. It leads you to question, so what, right? US government caught freezing vaccine petition regarding people to have own free choice. So again, this is an article, if you decide you want to follow the link, basically says, well, the petition was at, for the sake of argument, 5,222 signatures, and it didn't increase. It must be that something is wrong here. But again, it really gets into the weeds and it's hard to figure out, so what? And so we asked what led to article shares, and we found results that were consistent with the theory. Gist was the strongest predictor of whether an article was shared at least once, and it was the only predictor of whether an article was shared more than once. In contrast, whether or not an article contained a story was not significant. So in other words, the only time a story mattered was if it communicated this gist or this bottom line meaning. Interestingly, statistics also mattered. So this idea that facts don't matter turns out not to be supported by our data. In fact, there are people who do make sense of the facts, but you can't assume that that's true for everyone. And then finally, we replicated this on Twitter data. I'm not going to go too much into the details here, but we identified a topic pertaining to vaccines causing autism compared to a topic that was just about a vaccine autism link, so it doesn't have that causal meaning-making component. And we find that that topic was one of only two topics that predicted retweets. The other one was a topic about pet vaccines. You see a lot of times things pertaining to pets. People really, really like those. Interestingly, when that topic also included detailed verbatim information, it was less likely to be shared. And in fact, one of the things that we saw was that vivid media got you from 0 to 1 retweet, but it was only this vaccine's cause, this causal gist, this meaningful gist that allowed people to go viral, that allowed messages to go viral. So what does all this mean? our results here replicate across multiple platforms and have also been replicated actually in lab environments. Fuzzy trace theory has been replicated several times over the last 20 years. And so what it shows is that meaning making, giving people insight, seems to be associated with these messages going viral, people being able to transmit these messages. Precise facts do matter, but the effect size is small, which may be because facts don't always matter for everyone. There are some people who tend to prefer getting just the facts, but most people need those facts interpreted. They need people to say, here are the facts, and here's what you should conclude from that. So an effective online message communicates a clear gist. It answers why to an otherwise mysterious event. So in conclusion, really what I want to emphasize here is that when people are inundated with information, as they are around COVID and the COVID infodemic, give them insight. Don't try to give them more facts. Try to help them figure out, what does this all mean? Certainly there are all sorts of malicious actors online that are trying to fill that meaning thread. And so the challenge for those of us who would like to communicate the right thing to do in the case of public health is to help people make sense of all the information that they have available. And there are several leading theories that give us actionable insights into how to do that. Basically, we want to communicate a simple bottom line meaning in addition to the facts. Here's what it means for you. And so with that, I am happy to open the floor to questions. And I can either take the question that's in the box, or Lorien, if you want to drive from here on out, I'm more than happy to do that.
Well, first, David, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I don't have the ability to write my questions in the boxes, so I have to ask them. And so I'll start with me, and then we can go to the questions in the box. And if people have additional questions, feel free to write them in. So I was thinking about GIST and how it's very much focused on this idea that, you know, people are individuals and they get information, and in this case, the information is like about the essence and meaningful action, and then they change their beliefs and then they act differently because they have new beliefs. But really we're talking about all of this within the context of social media, and where everything is social, and you have friends influencing you, and you have likes and shares that you already see when you go into that information. So I just wondered how you think about those social aspects in addition to GIST, since you haven't really talked about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And the thing about GIST, of course, is that GIST is fundamentally associated with morals and values. People make decisions based on how, not only how they interpret the information, the gist that they get, but also whether that gist says, and therefore that's good, and therefore that's bad. So for example, you know, somebody may say something along the lines of, the government's trying to tell you what to do. The gist may be the government's trying to tell you what to do, right? But then, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? That depends on your values, and your values are very much consistent with and aligned with your social groups. So being part of a particular social group generally means that you share the values of that group. And when you share the values, that tells you, given a particular interpretation, here's what you should do. Okay, so the gist and the values interact. They have a way of working together. And so there may be some people that say, well, I want the government telling me what to do. For them, they see the government as a protector, as somebody that is going to, you know, that has their best intentions at heart. And so if the gist of a message is, well, the government wants you to vaccinate, they may be like, great, I will do it because I trust the government, and you know, I value government guidance. Whereas somebody who tends to be more on the libertarian side may be like, no, the government will do what's right for the government, and it will not do what's right for the citizen. And I'm not going to trust the government. My social group tells me that the government can't be trusted. And there are all sorts of reasons why a particular social group may or may not, for example, trust the government, that are associated with their own history. And in fact, one of the things you see is that anti-vaccine campaigns are very good at targeting those particular groups. So for example, African Americans that have memory of the Tuskegee syphilis fiasco, will often bring that up when they communicate to African Americans about trust in government. They'll say, well, the government's telling you to get the COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available. They're telling you to wear a mask. Remember what happened last time you listened to the government, right? And so they're very, very good at communicating the gist in a way that speaks to the values of particular communities. And that's something that I think public health communicators need to improve on. They need to figure out how to target and tailor in a way that not only addresses the interpretation, the gist, but it addresses what does that mean for that community and how does that address their values.
And then just to follow up, but there are, people are looking at the headlines, the gist of a headline, but with other metrics, like my friend Marianne liked that. Mm-hmm. Have you looked at studies or do you know of studies that have taken that into account?
Yeah, so that's it's a good question, and no, I'm not familiar with studies that have looked at how many times has the fact that a friend, how many likes leads me to like it or not. Now that being said, it's a little difficult to disentangle that because now we're getting into the way that the algorithm interacts with the person. And so if something is liked by lots and lots of my friends, the algorithm's more likely to show it to me because the algorithm may have decided that I might like it too. So it's really hard to disentangle those two things. And I don't always like to say more research is needed, but this is a case where we really do need to figure out how to disentangle these two things because the technology clearly matters here too.
Right. Okay, so we have a question. Do you want me to read it to you?
By all means.
Here we go. What is your take on the percentage of a Twitter conversation is needed to influence or steer the broader conversation on a topic or narrative? Some say it's as low as 1%, while others argue it's higher. Could the 1.4% of not credible sources on Twitter be then influencing the debate? And this goes back to your pie chart.
Yes, so that is an excellent question. I wish I knew the answer. I wish I could put a number on it. But what I can talk about is a phenomenon that Joan Donovan at Harvard has called, I believe, source hacking. I apologize if I got the label wrong. But essentially the idea that what a lot of these low credibility sources will do is they'll say something that they know is completely outrageous because that will get them picked up and repeated by mainstream news sources. So for example, the movie Plandemic that went viral was very successful at doing exactly this. Not only did they go viral on Facebook and YouTube, but they were successful in getting the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of the big names to report on how they were going viral, which of course made them go more viral. And so I really think we have to be very careful here. This is why I'm emphasizing the uncertainty of the information environment and why you can't necessarily count on source credibility as a good metric of whether something is good information or bad information. To the point of the person answering the question, a lot of these low credibility sources will they know they're low credibility sources. They're looking to get higher credibility sources to boost their signal. And when that happens, then they've won. So we can't just say, well, for the sake of argument, 95% of the content that's rated online, maybe it's not that high, but whatever, some large proportion of the content that's repeated online comes from a credible news organization. And, we tell that by looking at the web address, the URL that it came from. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that the content itself is credible because they actually may be involved in driving people to those low credibility sites. Because they're being used as sort of unwitting pawns in the game. And so this is actually something that I think is core to IDDP's mission, right? How is it that journalists fit into this ecosystem? And if journalists are reporting on low credibility sites in order to say, look at, sort of the crazy things that people believe, what they actually may be doing is giving that fringe group a larger megaphone than they deserve. And in fact, that's one of the things that a lot of these fringe groups have been very successful about doing. They're very, very good at figuring out how to amplify their message and making the fringe seem like it's much more mainstream. They're very good at gaming the system. So I hope that answers the question.
I just first checked, are there any other questions from the participants? Oh, I see some, no open questions. Okay. I thought it was really interesting, your point about doctors and the health system and how we tend to communicate, which is about choice in that, like, let me help you make an informed choice, and here's the facts, and here the pros and the cons, and together we'll make an informed choice, which is really the opposite of what you're advocating for with the gist way, which is I'm the doctor and I really think that vaccinating is the best way.
Well, I want to, yeah, so I want to actually push back on that a little bit. I'm not, so there is a sort of a paternalistic approach here that is based on authority that says, you know, I'm the doctor, you should listen to me because I know best, right? That's not what I'm advocating here. I'm not advocating that that it should just be an appeal to authority because we know that that's something that people respond to negatively for good reason. People are empowered to make a choice. But what I am advocating is that the doctor help the patient, and in many cases also I believe that journalists should help their audiences to understand what the facts mean, okay? And that doesn't mean telling them what to do, but it does mean giving them some insight and giving them important context, that giving them just the facts in a decontextualized way will not help them to do. So if you tell somebody, for the sake of argument, 5% of people who, you know, who are, you know, in the middle of a measles outbreak will get the measles, right? Well, 5% sounds really low, okay? And say, well, you know, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to vaccinate my kids. 5% is low. It's not that big a deal, right? But when you tell them, yeah, but 5% is 1 in 20. 1 in 20 when you are in a, for example, a classroom of, you know, maybe 25 people, that means one of the classmates is going to get the measles and that person's going to expose everyone else. And all of a sudden, everyone's going to get the measles. And it only takes one. So what do you want to do? Right? You're still telling people the facts, but you're contextualizing those facts. You're not telling them, you should vaccinate because I'm the doctor and I think it's right. You're telling them, here's what that means for you. And I think the key point here is we need to get better at giving people the insight. This notion of it only takes one, it only takes once, right, is a categorical gist. It's factually accurate, and it is a correct interpretation of what the probabilities are, but it doesn't just give people, it doesn't just dump numbers on people. Right, which is something that you know, I think we've tried before with limited success.
So I'm aware that we're out of time. So we want to thank you, David, for an excellent presentation. Hopefully we in public health get better at writing the messages that look at gist, give people narratives that fit their pre-existing stories and values, and hopefully when the vaccine comes out for coronavirus, we can convince people to take it.
Thank you very much.
So with that, thank you. And I think that's the last one for the summer webinar series, but maybe there'll be another series coming up in the fall. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.